if one of these missiles goes wrong and goes into a civilian area or hits a civilian target rather than a military target, what do we expect Russia to do? And then we're into the spectre, perhaps not the actuality, but the spectre of nuclear confrontation, which nobody wants. I do think Putin is bluffing. He's bluffed on numerous occasions, numerous red lines have been crossed, and he's done very little about it. But at the same time, I'm kind of with Jake Sullivan, actually. I'm kind of with the American line here in terms of saying there's got to be a better way.
Then, this front page story in the Sunday Times. 5 former Conservative Defence Secretaries and Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, of course, seemingly pressuring Sir Keir Starmer to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. And the kind of point of this, as you'll have heard over the course of breakfast this weekend, is about the US giving approval or not. And the front page story on the Sunday Times today from the aforementioned Defence Secretaries and PM is, who cares? Don't wait for the US, just go for it, Keir Starmer. Joel, what do you think? Is this sensible?
I think it's fairly inevitable. Frankly, I wouldn't pay a blind bit of attention to what Boris Johnson has got to say about anything. And I think Keir Starmer is a naturally cautious, will weigh up all the options. I mean, it is very compelling. I think what is very interesting, actually, and you were talking to him earlier, Mark Urban, who's joined the Sunday Times, hugely respected former diplomatic correspondent for Newsnight on the BBC. And he's got a very long piece about the desire for an endgame, which I think is much more interesting, that both Russia and Ukraine are really, they're war weary, they're broke, they're running out of troops, and everybody's waiting to see who will blink first. But of course, in the meantime, you've got China and Iran who are helping Russia with their armaments and weapons. And I think, Starmer is quite right to be cautious. It is very, very tempting to say, yes, go ahead and do it. But he's got to go in tandem with the US. And I think, behind the scenes, I'm quite sure there is pressure on the American government to give the go ahead. I mean, it's such a difficult time, Callum, because within a few weeks, we may have a different president, a different government in America, and that could change everything. So in a way, the pressure is to do something perhaps before Trump gets back in. But on the other hand, if both sides really, really want to come to some sort of end game, some sort of negotiated settlement, then I'm sure there are an awful lot of diplomatic moves going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things there. One is that, Kamala Harris might get in, and I suppose Trump would suggest that actually he would be the one to bring the two sides together and to bring a conclusion to this war. I'm also struck, Joe, by what you say about Boris Johnson. You wouldn't listen to him on anything, but Boris Johnson's connection and affection for Ukraine and from Ukraine is actually quite well known.
Yes, it is. But he was right to do what he did, and he was really up there and up front supporting Zelensky and supporting Ukraine. But if you look back at any part of his checkered career as Foreign Secretary, he managed to screw up quite spectacularly on quite a lot of things, and he's not known for detail. He is known very much for gestures. And I think one has to be very careful. There's an awful lot of people, including Kim Darroch, former British ambassador to Washington, saying over the weekend, Putin is probably bluffing. But, you're a prime minister. You are, in theory, putting your entire country and population at risk of escalating the war. So you've got to do it, it's not just us. We've got to do it in concert with other people.
Yeah.
And if we're the ones leading the pack, then that's fine. But you can't just go it alone. You need to have the other people with you.
Peter, Adam Bolton on this programme a little while ago suggested that actually these defence secretaries and Boris Johnson are probably following the mood of Keir Starmer's government anyway. It is the US that is an outlier here. And so with that in mind, I wonder what Keir Starmer is weighing up. Isn't this an opportunity for him to be the strong man, to get in the face of Putin and to make a statement that way?
I mean, he could, but I'm with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor in America, on a more dovish side of this. There has to be an end game. Mark Urban's piece is fascinating and points towards exactly what Joe says about an exhausted Russia, a very cautious and annoyed West, by which I really am talking, I suppose, about America. They are a superpower. They are the ones that could be the game changer here. Whether storm shadows are used or not, I don't think really is the issue here. Particularly, we've seen Ukraine changing its approach. It has incursions into Russia itself. That to me isn't defensive. If one of these missiles goes wrong and goes into a civilian area or hits a civilian target rather than a military target, what do we expect Russia to do? And then we're into the spectre, perhaps not the actuality, but the spectre of nuclear confrontation, which nobody wants. I do think Putin is bluffing. He's bluffed on numerous occasions. Numerous red lines have been crossed, and he's done very little about it. But at the same time, I'm kind of with Jake Sullivan, actually. I'm kind of with the American line here in terms of saying there's got to be a better way. Why just continue to ramp this up, and why blindly say that Zelensky is right about everything? Zelensky is not the risen messiah. Ukraine is a very corrupt country, and we need to not be apologists for Putin, who's an evil, murderous dictator, but to see this with our critical faculties rather than simply saying blindly, Ukraine good, Russia bad.
That's interesting, that. I do wonder then what the way to get round this is, because, some of the comments from the defence secretaries today in the paper accused Sir Keir Starmer of, would make Britain appeasers of the Kremlin, says Ben Wallace, if they didn't act now.
That's just not true.
Gavin William, a dereliction of duty.
No, I completely disagree with that. And actually, if you look at what's going to happen at the UN General Assembly, which is in, this week, we're going to be in a situation where Zelensky is going to put his case forward. The UN together, collectively, is going to make a decision on this in terms of whether they are in agreement with him. America will do that as well. Zelensky, of course, wants this to happen as soon as possible, and I get that. I understand his reasoning on that. But the Americans are saying, let's just take a beat, work this out, and see what we want to do. And I think that is a very sensible state of affairs and plan of attack.
Do you know what I've been interested in, Joe, is the number of people who have texted in to the programme this morning, kind of criticising the UK and these defence secretaries and Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer collectively, saying the UK doesn't really have as much of a role on the world stage as it once did, and to sort of go around pretending like we are, the great influencer of events is actually not particularly helpful to anyone. There have been any number of texts up to that effect. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm amazed anyone can text in, given that Chloe couldn't remember the right number. So that's obviously your very loyal audience.
That was a low blow,
wasn't it? No, that's not true. Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we are not the great, world stage player that we used to be, and part of that, to go back to Boris Johnson, is because we traduced and trashed our reputation around the world on a variety of issues, not least of all Brexit, but also, by willing to break international law and so on and so forth. But I do think we can still have influence. And I do think that, behind the politicians are diplomats who do an amazing job around the world, dealing with extremely difficult, troublesome regimes and troublesome leaders. So I do think we've got some influence. We certainly don't have the influence that we would like to pretend we have. But I think, as Peter was just saying, and as I said at the beginning, that's why we need to work in partnership with other countries. We can't just go in and go, gung-ho, the Brits are coming, it's all going to be marvellous, because it isn't. This is very, very complicated. And we've already seen what happened in the German elections a couple of weeks ago. There's a turn against aid and support for Ukraine. If Trump gets in, yes, he'd be probably quite happy to say I've brought the war to an end, but he'd give in to Putin because he's not really interested in what happens in Ukraine. You've got the whole issue of what's going on, and the stuff that we can say here from the relative safety of a small island is very different to what people in Poland might be thinking.
Yeah.
So I think, we've got to take it in concert with everybody else.
Sure.
I don't think Joe's suggesting this, but I don't think Putin is going to invade Poland or take his war westward, because we keep saying it's interesting. You've a lot of military people, especially political people rather than operational military people, who are sort of slightly talking out of both sides of their mouth here. They're saying Putin's going to invade the West, Poland's next, the UK is going to be there eventually, and then saying, well, actually, he's on his knees. Well, it can't be both. And also, we've got a number of former senior military people in the UK saying, well, our military wouldn't last a month in a conflict, not least because we've given so many weapons and so much money to Ukraine. And that's fine if that's what you want to do, if that's what your military strategy is. But you can't say, well, now we've got to go into what it would effectively be. I mean, it's effectively a proxy war. Yeah. Well, it is a proxy war. We're effectively going to a full-blown war with Putin. We don't have the military resources. We don't have the will. And also, I think on the domestic front, there are a lot of people saying, you've just given Zelensky another 600 million quid. What about people at home? Maybe that should be your consideration, Keir Starmer.
Yeah.